Hey everybody, it's Sean. I'm here for the perspective grid portion of our tutorial in Illustrator. This is going to be one of those videos that's going to be sectioned out into multiple smaller ones because this is kind of a beast to have to look at. What we're going to be doing though is covering basic tips and tricks that will enable you to be able to go and make this or recreate this perspective grid demonstration, and hopefully we all get something useful out of it. But for now, let's just jump right in. What I want to do is I would like to create a new document. So I'm going to go to File, New. And I want it to be about 1,000 pixels by 1,000 pixels. And we can just go ahead and hit create. So what is the perspective grid? Why is it so difficult to wrap your mind around? The perspective grid is a tool that can be found right over here with the perspective grid tool. And when you click on it, you'll notice that you get this really intensive sort of looking grid pattern shape with a lot of different handles and a lot of different, options and variables that you can adjust. The first I'm just going to cover a bunch of these sort of guys, and we're going to try and hit them in some sort of order that'll make sense. So the first one up here at the very top, this just allows you to adjust the height of your grid. It's not necessarily going to adjust how high up you can place something. It's more just a visual cue for you to be able to understand what the perspective looks like as you get higher. The next one that you'll see to the left or to the right, these are your vanishing points of a two-point perspective. And what these do is it allows you to adjust the angle of which these vanishing points sort of disappear at. So you can make a really, aggressively angled perspective. You can also adjust the height at which these perspectives disappear at, right? So it depends on, if we can literally think of a building, you're sort of adjusting your view of this building. If we come down here to the bottom right or the bottom left, these guys are a little bit subtle. They're kind of tricky. This lets you adjust the overall placement of your perspective grid. This is kind of an important one because oftentimes I find people want to grab onto their vanishing points to change the position of things, and that doesn't really work out in everyone's favor at all. Going inwards toward the center here, we have the adjustment of our perspective grid on the left hand side, so you can adjust sort of how wide it comes towards us, and same for the right side. Okay, cool. And now down here, similar to the option that was up on top, you can adjust how low your perspective grid comes. It does change the angle slightly, so that's just something you want to be aware of, because now our vanishing points technically will be sitting up higher than they were previously. And then finally, this little diamond above everything here, this just adjusts the grid. Now, you might think that the grid disappears right here. It actually doesn't. When we zoom in and start to get closer, you can see the grid actually will automatically start to fill in as you do get closer. It's just Illustrator sort of saving itself some computing power of having to preview the entire grid all the way down into infinity. If you want, you can grab onto this little diamond here, and you can actually shorten the grid so that you don't have to see as much of it. And the purpose of this is just because maybe you don't need all of this information. You're not planning on your perspective going that far into its design. So that can be useful too, just for simplifying your view, your sort of view features in general. Now, this is all well and good. How do we get objects onto one side? How do we get objects onto another side? How do we understand how we're going to be looking at that? And the answer to all of that is actually up here in this little icon, okay? And right now you can see we have the blue side, the left side grid. That's the one that's active. So if I went and drew out a rectangle right now, let's just draw out like a nice bright red rectangle, okay? And I don't want it to have a stroke. All right, so rectangle tool, nice bright red rectangle. Actually, what I'm gonna do first is I'm gonna just exit out of my perspective grid tool so I can draw a rectangle. And we're gonna turn our grid back on. and the grid retains the options that you set up for it originally. Okay, so if I was to just go and hit V and try and drag this onto my grid, nothing's going to happen. For you to be able to interact with the perspective grid, you have to use the perspective grid selection tool or Shift P on your keyboard. When you have a side selected, that is the side that your shape is going to snap onto. So you can see that we have the blue or left side selected. Using our perspective grid selection tool, we can drag our shapes onto this perspective, and they will sort of use math to determine the size, scale, angle along the entire perspective grid. All right. So I'm just going to Command Z this. I'm going to snap it off of our perspective grid. And what if we want it to go onto our right side, our orange side? With the perspective grid tool or selection tool being utilized, you can come up here and you can click on the other side. And now we can drag our shape onto the other side of the perspective grid, right? And using the perspective grid selection tool, you can actually scale. You can click and drag and you can scale these objects visually along your grid. You can hold shift and keep them constrained. The only thing is when you're on the grid, it really does mess around with your eyes sort of understanding of what constrained proportions really look like. So just something you want to be aware of. Now let's say I wanted to create a floor for our perspective grid. With my rectangle snapped off of the grid by hitting Command Z, I'm going to go and select the horizontal grid, the green grid, right? You can see green is the floor. And using the perspective grid selection tool, Shift V on your keyboard, see it, there it is. We are going to drag our rectangle onto the floor. And I'm just going to try and match it up as best I can right there. Okay? So you can click and drag this out to create a much bigger floor. All sorts of different stuff can sort of be done here. Now let me just see if we go and we adjust the perspective grid after we've applied a shape to it. It does not change the attributes of the shapes that are on the grid. Okay, our shape will stay the same. So it's pretty crucial that when you get your grid set up, you really should not be adjusting your perspective grid anymore. Okay, and one thing that I can show you guys is with our perspective grid tool highlighted, we can come up to view and we can go to perspective grid. And you can actually do a few different things here that's really awesome. You can lock the grid so that we can no longer adjust. Oh, that's weird. You're supposed to be able to lock it. All right. Well, you're supposed to be able to lock the grid so that you cannot adjust it. I don't know why. Oh, there it is. So yeah, all of our handles are actually locked. I can't go in and adjust it. All that I can do is sort of go in and adjust things like the height of it. Of course, I picked the one handle that you're actually allowed to adjust. So you can see our grid is completely locked. That can be very useful once you get it set and you like where it is. We can also hide the grid. I believe that was Shift Command I brings the grid on and hides it just for fast viewing options. We can also define this grid. So if this is a grid that you know that you like to use frequently, you can actually go and create a grid preset, right? You can change the colors of the different sections of it. So maybe you don't like orange. Maybe orange is a color that you're using a lot of and it's really hard for you to actually see what's going on. You can change that color to something completely different and sort of have an easier time using it. You can also change the opacity of the grid. I'm just going to leave it at 50 where it was. And up in here, you can actually change it to a bunch of different things. We can have a 1-point perspective, a 2-point, which is what we're using, and a 3-point. I'm going to get into that in a second. Scale, you could adjust the scale if you really wanted to. And yeah, that's pretty much everything that you would need to define a perspective grid if you use this feature frequently. So let's go to perspective grid. I'm going to unlock it. go back to perspective grid, and I'll show you what 1 point looks like. This is 1 point. And for those of you who took art in elementary school and high school, you're probably fairly familiar with something that looks like this. The handles look a little bit different compared to what we are used to seeing with the 2 point, but they all operate in a similar capacity. If you want to, you can just sort of go around and play around with some of the options that we have here, but you can tell that they all function in the exact same way. There are just fewer options than what we were used to with 2 point. That's the only thing. Cool. So that's 1 point. We looked at 2 point because that's the default. And now we can see 3 point. And 3 point looks kind of similar to 2 point, but it's a little bit different just because now you get the ceiling of a building instead of like sort of it being hidden by walls. So just something else to be aware of. For the most part, the controls are exactly the same. Just, slightly different sections of the perspective grid that they're going to end up manipulating. So just something to be aware of. If you guys are ever working with perspective and you want to figure out which type of perspective you're going to be working with, I would suggest just looking very closely at the reference that you're working from and trying to understand which point perspective it is that they're sort of drawing from, or that you should be drawing from. All right, cool. Let me see if there's anything else under here that could be useful. You can save this grid as a preset if you really wanted to, and that way it would just be much faster for you to snap back to it if you need to jump from into a new file but still have the same similar sort of perspective setup. Now, if you wanted to quickly jump between these three sections, you can actually use the number keys on your keyboard. So 1 is the blue or the left side, 2 is the floor or the green side, and 3 is the orange or the right side. Subsequently, you can also use 4, and 4 means that you are not active on the perspective grid. So those 4 keys, 1, 2, 3, 4, allow you to quickly jump between the different modes, and you can see it sort of up here. So just something to be aware of. I personally find the keyboard shortcuts to be the easier way to go about things, but that is just me. You guys, when you're first starting out, might find it easier to physically come up here and click on the individual sections that you want to be working with. If you want to exit out of the perspective grid, you have to make sure you have the perspective grid tool selected, and you can come up here and you can click X. And when you click X, absolutely nothing now is working on the perspective grid, and we are good to go. So in the next video, I'm going to be walking you guys through sort of more about placing shapes on the grid and starting to build very basic sort of elements in it. So I'll catch you guys there.